Bias blind spot. This is the inclination to believe that we are less prone to cognitive biases than others. Gambler's fallacy. This fallacy arises when one believes that past events alter the probabilities of future events, even though they remain unchanged. Omission bias. This is the tendency to perceive harmful actions as worse or less moral compared to equally harmful inactions. Proportionality bias. This bias reflects our natural inclination to assume that significant events have equally significant causes, which also might explain why we are drawn to conspiracy theories. Moral credential effect. This occurs when someone who has done a good deed feels entitled to behave less virtuously in the future. Self-serving bias. It's the tendency to attribute successes to oneself more than failures. Framing effect. The framing effect describes how people draw different conclusions from the same information depending on how it's presented. This also includes the contrast effect, where the perception of a stimulus is enhanced or diminished when compared with something contrasting. Actor-observer bias. This bias involves overemphasizing personality traits when explaining others' behavior and underemphasizing situational factors, while doing the opposite for our own actions. Picture superiority effect. The concept that images are more easily and frequently remembered compared to their written word counterparts. Outcome bias. It's the tendency to judge a decision based on its outcome rather than the quality of the decision at the time it was made. Mere exposure effect. This psychological phenomenon leads people to develop a preference for things simply because they are familiar with them. Hard-easy effect. The tendency to overestimate one's ability to accomplish difficult tasks and underestimate one's ability to complete easy ones. Survivorship bias. This occurs when we focus on those who have succeeded in a process, overlooking those who did not because they are less visible. Baader-Meinhof Phenomenon. Also known as frequency illusion, it is the illusion where something newly learned or noticed suddenly seems to appear more frequently than before. Availability heuristic. The tendency to overestimate the likelihood of events that are easily recalled, often influenced by their recency or emotional impact. Dunning-Kruger Effect. This effect is the tendency for less skilled individuals to overestimate their abilities, while experts often underestimate theirs. Halo Effect. This is the tendency for one positive or negative trait to influence perceptions of other traits in a person. Pygmalion Effect. The phenomenon where others' expectations influence the behavior of the target person, often leading to a self-fulfilling prophecy. Decoy Effect. Commonly used in marketing, this effect occurs when the introduction of a third option changes preferences between two existing options, especially when the third option is inferior in some respects and superior in others. Selection bias. Selection bias is the bias introduced by the selection of individuals, groups, or data for analysis in such a way that proper randomization is not achieved, thereby failing to ensure that the sample obtained is representative of the population intended to be analyzed. Anchoring bias. The tendency to rely too heavily on the first piece of information received when making decisions. This is why first impressions are so important. They paint a picture of what the other person is, and that picture gets anchored, making it hard to change. This bias is often exploited during negotiations when the seller gives a seemingly unreasonable high price. That price becomes the starting point for the negotiation, and the buyer inadequately adjusts from it. This is why first impressions are so powerful. Confirmation bias. The tendency to seek out, interpret, and remember information that confirms our pre-existing beliefs. Overconfidence effect. The inclination to be overly confident in one's own answers to questions. For example, for certain types of questions answers that people rate as 99%, certain turn out to be wrong 40% of the time. Egocentric bias. The tendency to rely too heavily on our own perspective or have an inflated opinion of ourselves. Examples of this are the false consensus effect, which is the tendency for people to overestimate the degree to which others agree with them, and the false uniqueness bias, which is the tendency of people to see their projects and themselves as more singular than they actually are. Information bias. The tendency to seek out information even when it doesn't impact the decision at hand. Hindsight bias. Also known as the "I knew it all along" effect, this bias leads us to see past events as more predictable than they were. Projection bias. The tendency to overestimate the extent to which our future selves will share our current preferences, thoughts, and values, thus leading to sub-optimal choices. Apophenia. the tendency to perceive connections or meaningful patterns between unrelated things. This bias is one of the ways a stereotype can lead people to expect certain groups and traits to fit together, and then to overestimate the frequency with which these correlations actually occur. Another type of apophenia is parolia, which happens, for example, when you see images of animals in the clouds. Serial position effect, the tendency to better recall the first and last items in a list compared to the middle ones. Recency bias, this bias places greater importance on the most recent events, such as an interviewer who can vividly remember just the last person he interviewed because they're the most recent conversation they had. It's related to the serial position effect. Authority bias, the tendency to attribute greater accuracy to the opinions of an authority figure, regardless of the content. Unit bias, this bias reflects the tendency to perceive the suggested amount of consumption, such as a food serving size, as appropriate, even if it is excessive. Availability cascade, a self-reinforcing process where a collective belief gains more credibility as it is repeated more frequently. It can be summarized in the phrase "repeat something long enough, and it will become true." It's related to the availability heuristic. Bandwagon effect, the tendency to adopt behaviors or beliefs because others are doing the same, often to fit in or due to a lack of information. Illusory truth effect, people are more likely to believe statements they have heard before, even if they don't remember where they heard them. Next in line effect, when taking turns speaking in a group, people often have diminished recall for the words of the person who spoke immediately before them. Ingroup bias, the tendency to favor people who are perceived to be part of our own group. Spotlight effect, the tendency to overestimate how much others notice our appearance or behavior. Choice supportive bias, the inclination to remember our choices as better than they were, often by overemphasizing the positives of chosen options and the negatives of rejected ones. Ostrich effect, the tendency to avoid potentially negative but useful information to prevent psychological discomfort. Selective perception bias, the tendency to not notice or to forget stimuli that cause emotional discomfort or contradict prior beliefs. Peak end rule, the phenomenon where people judge experiences based on their peak and how they ended, rather than the entire experience. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more content like this, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Drop a comment below with your thoughts or suggestions for future content. I'd love to hear from you.